In terms of the actual Shiur itself, as you probably know, it's a Parshat Hashavua Shiur. So the past practice has been we would do on Tuesday night what we're going to be landing on Shabbos. However, as you probably also know, it's Shavuot this week. So we're not going to be reading Parshat Hashavua, which would be Naso, which will be next week. So I thought tonight, what I wanted to do with you is share some thoughts about Megillat Ruth. So it's not Parsha, but it certainly is biblical. And it's one of the most extraordinary, even though it's short, it's only 4 chapters. It's an extraordinary book, extraordinary Megillah. And I thought I would share with you some insights, which I'm not sure that you've heard before, but maybe you have. If you have, learning again and repeating is called Chazara, and that's never a bad thing. But I'm going to begin anyway. So I don't know if you have a Tanakh with you, but instead of going to the Parsha, we're going to be taking a look at Megillat Ruth. So let me begin by just talking generally about the role of Megillat Ruth. So as you know, the book is read on Shavuot. But why was the book originally written? It's an interesting story of Naomi and Elimelech, and they're leaving the country. We'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the reasons it's offered by the Rishonim as to why Megillat Ruth was written, interestingly enough, is not so much the beginning of the book, but because the last several verses. The last several verses tell us about the genealogy of David and Melech. And why would that be important for us to learn about the genealogy of David and Melech? It's because during his lifetime, David and Melech's legitimacy to the throne was a topic of a lot of question. And not everybody felt that David and Melech actually was a legitimate king of Israel. What? Why was he not a legitimate king of Israel? And the reason that he was not a legitimate king of Israel is because at the very end of the book, when his lineage is indicated, we're reminded of the fact that his ancestor Ruth, as you know, came from the people of Moab. Okay, so the problem with that is that there's an explicit prohibition in the book of Devarim, which says, Ammoni u'Moavi, that a Ammonite coming from the nation of Ammon and a Moabite coming from the nation of Moab should never be allowed to convert to Judaism and to become part of classical normative Jewish life. Well, Ruth comes from Moab, and she married Boaz, and Boaz and Ruth together had a baby, and it's from that baby that David and Melech comes from. And so if David and Melech is a direct descendant of a convert that comes from the nation of Moab, is that not an indication that he's illegitimate, that he should not, in fact, have any rights to the throne of Jewish life? Because his birth stems from a biblical prohibition. So that became a source of real conflict for David, and this was thrown in his face more than once during the time that he served as the king of Israel. So the Gemara has to answer that, and the Gemara does answer that and says, while the biblical prohibition is clear that an Ammonite, and in this case the Moabite, which is more important, should not convert, the prohibition applied only to the males of the nation. Why? So the Gemara tells us one of the main reasons for why it applies to the males of the nation, not to the females, is because Moab and Ammon were two nations who, as you know, come from the family of the Jewish people. How so? Because Moab and Ammon are the descendants of Lot. Lot is the nephew of Abraham. So Ammon and Moab, as it were, are related to Avraham Avinu. We are the descendants of Avraham Avinu. Therefore, Ammon and Moab are shtikl mishpacha. They're not exactly the closest relatives, but they're not so far. Lot was a nephew. Lot's children were Ammon and Moab. But they weren't born under the most, I guess, kosher circumstances. His daughters, Lot's daughters, inebriated him. He had sex with him while he was drunk, and he gave birth. Amazing. But that doesn't explain why Hashem did not want them to be part of the Jewish people. And here's the answer. The reason that they didn't become part of the Jewish people is because when Bnei Israel left Mitzrayim and they were traversing the desert from Mitzrayim on the way to Eretz Yisrael, they had to cross through certain territories. I'm sorry that my phone in the background nobody in my house is picking up. They stopped the call. Sorry. So, and it's likely spam. I hope none of you think that the Shiur is likely spam either. 1 second. Thank you. Sorry. When they were traversing the desert, they had to cross through the territory of Ammon and Moab. So this is shtikol mishpacha. So it's like after the Holocaust. Jews, survivors, were looking for any family. And any family did whatever they could to help them. Money, or whatever it was. People helped each other, and that's the way they should. But Ammon and Moab, instead of helping Bnei Israel by greeting them, giving them food, giving them water, they said, no, you can't come through our territory. We're not giving you a helping hand. Forget it. They turned their backs against their own family. If this is what they did against their own family, then Torah says they can't be part of a family. That's not what family does. And if they're rejecting whatever sense of familial loyalty and obligations that they had, then from this point on, they can't. But here's the gap. Who should have been the ones to go out and to greet the Jews? Not the women. In the ancient world, as you know, that wasn't the woman's role. The woman's role was not to sort of leave the camp and to go outside of the camp in order to greet people and to give everybody food or drink or water. That should have been the responsibility of the males. And in that ancient world, maybe the women prepared the little heckles, maybe the women baked cakes and cookies and said to the husbands, okay, now take it to the family and tell them it's from us and it's part or dairy or whatever. But it would have been the men whose job it was to go out. So therefore, the Gemara says, because it would have been the men's responsibility to go out, not the women, it was the men who therefore became perpetually forbidden to convert to Judaism, not the women. David HaMelech is a direct descendant of a woman from Moab who genuinely, authentically, and properly converted to Judaism. And so, while his conversion was legitimate halachically, some of the uneducated people in Israel weren't aware of that. And that's why some of them challenged David HaMelech's authenticity. David HaMelech, as you know, his birthday is Shavuos, and therefore his story is read on Shavuot as a way of supporting and establishing his legitimacy as a king. But there's another reason, and this is going to be more of the reason that I want to explore with you tonight. Gemara, the Midrash on the collection of Midrashim and Masechet on Megillah Rut, says the following, quoting Rabbi Zera. Megillah zo ein balo tuma velo tahara. This Megillah Rut, once you read it, you realize doesn't discuss any ritual questions or difficulties regarding impure and pure. Ein eser v'leheter. There's nothing that discusses. There's no critical isur v'heter. It's a lovely story. It's a love story. It's a betrayal story, but it's not a halachic discussion. So why was it written? What does it add to our understanding of Jewish law? What does it add to our understanding of, I guess, the bigger picture of our lives? And so the answer is, the answer is to teach us the reward that awaits those who disperse kindness in the world. And it's in the context of that, the notion that Megillah Rut becomes a quintessential story of chesed, not of halacha, not of isur v'heter, forbidden mutter. It's not. It's a story of chesed. And it's in that context that I want to spend some time with you comparing two stories in the Tanakh, which you may not think about as being similar, but I want to begin first by showing you or discussing the possible similarities. One story is Ruth, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And the other is the story of Job, the man the quintessential story of suffering in the Tanakh. And I want to sort of compare and contrast the two stories and suggest how Megillah Rut ultimately can be seen as a response to the story and the messages of the book of Eov, which is a difficult book to read because of its darkness of pessimism and a man who suffered so much throughout much of the book until the very end. So let's just begin with with a sort of overview of some of the similarities and see where that takes us. So one of the similarities, of course, as I mentioned a second ago, is both books deal with loss and suffering. So if you take a look of the story of Naomi, Naomi is married to a man, Elliott, a wealthy man, a respected man, a man of position and status in the city of Bethlehem in Israel. People respected him, people turned to him for advice, people turned to him for monetary support, people turned to him for tzedakah. As a result of a famine in the land, things got really, really difficult, and people started turning more and more to Elliott for handouts, for help. So according to the book of Megillah, at the beginning of the story, he leaves Bethlehem, takes his wife, he packs up in the middle of the night, he walks away, he turns his back, and he moves to another country, and the country that he chooses to move to is Moab. In and of itself, it's like a startling thought, that you go to a country which historically is not a country that is kind to the Jewish people. It's a country from which, according to even the books of the Torah, there had been continued and ongoing attacks into the land of Israel, but more than that, it's a country of betrayal. So maybe it sort of fits in an ironic sense that the man who betrays and leaves his family and his community ends up going to the country which epitomizes betrayal. Family that turns its back on family when things get tough. So, as a result of this, the beginning of the Megillah tells us Elimelech dies and his two sons die, Machlon and Kilda. They had married two women, Orpah and Ruth, but Naomi leaves as a wife and as a mother. And in a short period of time, she's left a widow and childless. And you can only begin to imagine the suffering, the emotional trauma that this woman has to go through. So it's a story of loss and suffering at the very beginning. It's a death of family. It's a loss of possessions. She left a rich woman. All of that was gone. And when she ultimately returns to Bethlehem, as the Megillah tells us, the people look at her and say, "Is that you, Naomi? We hardly recognized you. You're a shell of your former self." But that's also true with the story of Eob. Eob, of course, the story where the Satan challenges God and says, this guy, he's only religious, he's only a believer, he only says the right things because you're giving him everything you want. But the minute you test him, the minute you take away all the things in his life that are positive and enriching, you're going to see, says the Satan to God, he's going to leave you. And so I guess the gauntlet has been thrown and the story develops where suffering after suffering is sent upon Eob. And the problem, or not the problem, the common thread that binds both stories of suffering is that there's no apparent way for either Naomi or for Eob to reestablish themselves on their own. They are in the midst of this indescribable darkness, and there's no way out. There's no light. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. Naomi sees herself as getting what she deserves. Why? Because she's left the country. She's left the country. And in fact, if you think her loss was so intense, she lost her husband, lost two sons. Some even say she left the land of Israel while she was pregnant with another child, and that child died as well. So it's one layer and another of sadness, of loss, of desperation. So that's one thing that binds the two stories, story of loss. But the stories can also be connected in another way, turning the tables. They have hopeful endings to them. So the destroyed families are somehow rejuvenated. Let's go back to the story of Ruth. Naomi. Naomi comes back. Her beloved daughter-in-law, Ruth, while given an opportunity not to come back to Israel but to stay in Moab, she rejects that. She rejects staying back with her father's house. Her husband died. Her father-in-law died. The only person she has is her beloved mother-in-law, Naomi, and she chooses to cleave to Naomi instead of going back to the environment that she knows and staying in Moab and fitting in and maybe rebuilding her life. She decides to go back. And by deciding to go back, she in fact does have a family and she does have a future. She doesn't see it right away. She ends up marrying Boaz. And Eob himself, he gives birth, as the book of Job tells us, he gives birth to new children. So Eob sees children from 4 generations, and that's in Perek Mem Beit of the book of Eob if you're looking. And Ruth concludes with 4 generations from Naomi. So we have this sort of similarity again. 4 generations for Eov, 4 generations from Ruth. I'm not going to read all the verses, but it's a similarity that's hard to sort of say, oh, it's not a coincidence. As I've said before, it's not a coincidence. The Tanakh, the Torah, I think, is building towards some sort of opportunity for us to take a look at a bigger picture. Here's another linguistic connection, and again, I think it's an appropriate sort of appropriate connection. So when talking, I'm just going to open up. I'm going to be turning to, if anybody's following, chapter Membek, which is 42, Pasuk Yud Gimel, 42 Yud Gimel, and here's what it says. Vahilo shiv'ana vanim v'shalosh banot. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. This is Eov, after sort of his life is rejuvenated, reborn, refreshed. So he has 7 sons. Take a look from Megillat Ruth towards the end of Megillat Ruth. Asher hi tova lecha mishiva banim. So Boaz says to Naomi, you know, this wonderful woman that you brought back with you from Moab, her name is Ruth. She's better to you than 7 sons. So again, that number, is it a coincidence? Maybe. 7 is a number that often appears in many different rabbinic and biblical writings. It represents wholeness, fullness, completion, return, a cycle. But it does mention both numbers, that at the end of his life, Eov again has 7. And in discussing the richness of Naomi's life, the number 7 is also mentioned as a description of fullness. When does the story happen of Megillat Ruth? Well, Megillat Ruth, as it says in the very, very beginning of Megillat Ruth, takes place at a time which is called Vayihi B'mei Shevot HaShoftim. It's the period of time of the judges. So just to put this in the historical context, Moshe Rabbeinu dies. The leader of the people now becomes Yehoshua. He's one responsible to help the Jews cross into Eretz Canaan. He leads the war of conquest for 7 years. He leads the period of 7 years following that of apportionment of the land to the various Shvatim. And he's the one who helped settle and create the first Jewish settlement, the first sovereign Jewish settlements in the land of Israel. So it's that period of time, the period of time called the Judges. So when Yehoshua dies, there is no Navi yet. There is no one appointed after Yehoshua to lead the people. Yehoshua is appointed after Moshe's death, but there's no one who's appointed after Yehoshua. And so what the Sefer Shoftim tells us is that there's a series of individuals called Shoftim, judges, who ascend to positions of authority and leadership throughout this period of time. Some of them are stronger, some of them are not so strong. One of the most famous ones, of course, is Shimshon, but he's not the only one. And these are people whose job it is to lend a spiritual direction, a spiritual strength, to give some sort of moral compass direction to the people of Israel. But that's when the book of Megillat Ruth takes place, according to the explicit mention. What about Eov? So there's actually a machloket when the story of Eov takes place. But Rabbi Elazar in the Gemara says that story also takes place in the very same time, in the period of time, according to Rabbi Elazar, where the Shoftim ruled in the land of Israel. Just like the story of Ruth unfolds then, so does the story of Eov unfold then. So where do we go with these similarities? Like, what's to be learned from the fact that there are similarities between Eov and Ruth? Coincidence or not? I want to suggest to you that the similarities help sharpen the qualitative distinctions between the two, which focus in the manner in which the Yeshua, the redemption, God's help, ultimately appears to the people. And that's where I'm going to be going with this at this point. So there definitely are similarities. But because there are similarities, the differences become a little sharper, a little bit clearer, a little bit more bold, and maybe even a little bit more informative and important. Okay, who's responsible for the fate of these two protagonists? So let me just take a look with you. Both of the protagonists, both of them at certain points in the book, both of them, both Eov and Ruth, decry their suffering. They decry their suffering. Naomi is so open at the beginning of Megillat Ruth, And she says, this is happening to me. Why? Because Hashem is bringing this upon me. Hashem is bringing all the suffering upon me. And why does she think that? And she knows. She knows in her heart of hearts why. Because she followed her husband, and her husband made some serious mistakes. They left Israel. They turned their back on their family. They turned their back on their country, of Israel. They ended up in the land of an enemy. Their kids, sons, married Moabite women. Did they convert? Did they not convert? There's a machloket amongst some of the Rishonim. Let's say they did convert, which to be chas v'shalom, I don't want to speak bad about Machlon and Kilyon. But the fact that their names are Machlon and Kilyon led some of the rabbis to say they died because of their sins. Machlon from the word machlad, from disease. Kilyon from the word lechalot, which means to end, to eradicate. So both of them, in some ways, had borne names, although not known at the time that they were given by the parents, Elimelech and Naomi, but names in some ways which were foretelling the future. But Naomi says, this has been done to me because I did the wrong thing. She almost instinctively recognizes that Hashem brought this upon her. But in Eov, going back to the Sefer Eov, I'm going to go now to chapter 27. And I'm going to read to you the verse in chapter 27. Chapter 27, Pasuk Bet. Just give me a second, my friends. Listen to what he says in chapter 27. As God lives, I swear that he has removed justice from me, and the Almighty has embittered my soul. And the Almighty has embittered my soul. So he knows 100%. He knows that this is happening to him. It's not coincidence. Nothing happens in the world by coincidence, but this is being sent to him directly by God. Directly by God. So both he and Naomi are struggling with the realization that something, let's put it this way, they're struggling with the realization that the bitterness, the suffering in their lives is God sent. Now, it's probably true to each one of us, but these two people are going through very dark times, and they recognize that there's some message there. Let's go one step further. So that's how they see themselves. Let's take a look at how everybody else sees them. So everybody else would be the people in Beit Lechem when Naomi returns. So it's been a while. It's been 10 years. The famine that pushed Elimelech out of the land is now gone. Beit Lechem is once again rejuvenated. Beit Lechem is now feeling the blessings of God, not the challenges. People have food to eat. People have work again. People are resuming their natural lives. There's a halacha, as you may or may not know, that during years of famine, a husband and wife should stop cohabiting with each other lest they bring children into this world. That's not a time to bring children into the world. During a famine where you can't feed people is the wrong time to have a baby. So I'm assuming then that, keeping mindful of this, there's no babies being born in Beit Lechem throughout this. And now with the end of the famine, life is returning, not just the food, but life. Really, literally life. Babies are being born, people are walking out with their strollers, and you feel a huge sense of relief. So Naomi comes home after 10 years. And what does everybody say? Listen to this. I'm going to read to you from Megillah Ruth, and you can hear the... One second, friends, give me a second. You're probably thinking, you should have had this page open in front of you before you started the class. You're right, 100%. I did, but I lost the book, so I fell out of the book. So I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going to read this verse. Naomi comes back, and it's reading from chapter 1. It's verse 19. So Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth, who refused to leave her mother-in-law, they now walk and they return to Beit Lechem. Beit Lechem, and as they approached, they entered into the city. They're walking through, and you can just imagine people seeing these two strangers coming. One, according to the words of the Megillah, is identifiable as a Moabite woman. She's dressed, everybody recognizes her as a Moabite. She's not just some strange Jewish woman coming to the community. She's identified right away as a woman from Moab. So they come inside, and according to what it says in the book, the entire city was tumultuous over them. The Tomarna, and the women said, could this be Naomi? Like, who are you? You, and you can just imagine what she looks like. She's probably, in my mind, she's thinned out. She's not wearing anything very nice. It's not beautiful clothing that she may have worn once when she was a very respected lady in Bethlehem. But the community isn't sure who she is. Oh my God, what shock. And Eov, the same thing. It tells us that the people who looked at Eov following the tremendous suffering that befell him didn't recognize him. And sometimes a person going through really hard times, things change. Their body changes. Of course, they become often very pale, and they become very weak, and they're gaunt because they're not eating, and it's hard to recognize them. Their skin changes tone, and all of this happened to Eov. So the community, both in the book of Eov and both in Megillah Ruth, are looking at these two people and wondering, who are they? Only after Eov admits that he does not or cannot understand. 1 second. I think I just skipped something. 1 minute, my friends. Yeah. So everybody is wondering, who are they? What's going on here? So what we're hearing is there's a lot of similarities in what's happening. And the book of Eov constitutes human tragedy from Hashem's point of view. Meaning, the story is telling us what's happening in Shemayim. We, the readers, have been given the opportunity with the curtain pulled back to see that there's some sort of divine test happening here. Eov doesn't know that, but we know that. We know that because we're privy, as it were. The author of the book is showing us what's happening in the hallways in Shemayim, the conversations that are happening behind the curtain. Eov doesn't know. He's not aware. So the book of Eov considers human tragedy from God's point of view. Man, with his limited perspective and short lifespan, cannot judge God. Man's actions will not always directly determine his destiny. Eov seems like he's a good guy. And don't we know people like that? Don't we know people who look like they're good people? Something happens. And we say to ourselves, maybe sometimes we whisper this out loud, we say, we don't get it. It seems so, the next word, unfair. That's what the story of Eov sort of conjures up in us. Suffering that we just don't understand. We don't get it. Now, Hashem gets it, but we don't. We don't understand it. Even when man does not understand, according to the book of Eov, he still needs to know his place. We're Hashem's creations. I don't get it. I don't understand this. And Hashem says, yes, you don't understand it. But here's the way I'm writing the next chapter of your story. So you probably know when we say Yizkor, which we're going to say on the second day of Hashavua, there's a verse that's often amongst the verses that are read in the introductory section to Yizkor. And it says, Ma anosh ki tizkarenu ben adam ki tifkedenu. What is man that you remember him? And the Son of Man, you are mindful of him. It's a way of saying, look, God, so much stuff happens. And we know you're great and we're not. And we can't believe, why would you remember us? So the book of Eov is presenting us with suffering that we don't understand. Eov doesn't understand. Shem understands. And at the end of the book, Eov sort of tries to understand aspects of it. And he seems to be somewhat successful in it. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. But the book of Eov is trying to present us with this notion of suffering that's incomprehensible. But then we move to the book of Ruth. And as I said to you at the beginning, the book of Ruth is not about law. It's not about intellectual analysis of what is tamei, what is impure, what's pure, what's asur, what's mutar, what's permissible, what's not. It's not. As the Midrash says, it's only about one topic, and one topic only, chesed, kindness. So how really different things are in Megillat Ruth. It's the story in which God does not really act directly at all. He doesn't. Like, whereas in the book of Eov, it tells us, it says to us directly, it's written in the Pasuk, and this is what Hashem did. That's not mentioned at all in Megillat Ruth. Now, you and I, as readers who bear faith and understand, we may understand, or we may think, we may assume that when Elimelech died in Moab, that was God's punishment. When the two sons died, that was God's punishment. It never says that in the Megillah. It doesn't say it. It's left to us to maybe make those connections. But the Megillah itself does not divulge any direct action on the part of God. In Ruth, in Megillat Ruth, it is people with their acts of kindness who bring about the redemption. In the book of Eov, who brings the redemption to Eov? It's God himself, who was the same force that brought about the suffering in the beginning. So God takes it away at the end and tries to sort of, I'm not going to say take it back, but he gives Eov a way of rebuilding. That's not the case in Megillat Ruth. Ruth begins as a desolate woman who's lost everything. So how does she get back? How does she rejuvenate? How does she come back to a redeemed woman? Nothing of God is mentioned. So what is it? It's the people. It's the people who embrace her. It's the people who take bold actions that ultimately mean that she rebuilds, or not rebuilds, she builds the house of David HaMelech. It's not about Hashem. The book of Megillat Ruth tells us about what community can do. The whole essence of Megillat Ruth is a chain of kindness brought about by people of chesed. So on the one hand, you have Megillat, you have the book of Eov, which talks about darkness and loss and suffering and challenge, just like Megillat Ruth begins that way, of a family completely decimated, as is Eov's family completely decimated. But in Eov, the redemption comes from God. In Ruth, it doesn't. The redemption comes from people who bring their ability to inject chesed into the world, and that makes the difference. Here's some examples. So after the two sons of Naomi die in the fields of Moab, two sons are Machlon and Kilion, their two daughters-in-law who remain. One is Orpah and one is Ruth. And they remain with Naomi after the death of the two boys. They are lovely ladies, they're committed, and Naomi thanks them. Naomi, from the bottom of her heart, I find this, you read it like, you really feel the authenticity of Naomi coming through the words that are recorded in Megillat Ruth. She thanks them. And she says, Ya'aseh Hashem imachem chesed kasher asitem im hametim b'mitim. She says, Naomi also says, ladies, I want God, our God, to do chesed with you, just like you did chesed. You did chesed with who? With the dead, referring to her two dead sons. They were the wives of her two sons, and with me. So Naomi herself recognizes the chesed that was bestowed upon her. That's one example, but it goes further. Ruth, you just think about this. You're a Moabite woman. You were married to the son of a classy lady from Bethlehem, who now is decimated. She's lost everything, really, not only her family, her wealth, and she's now moving back to Israel, which was not considered to be a friendly country to Moab, and Moab was not a friendly country to Israel. And so Naomi turns to her daughter-in-law and says, you don't have to come with me. You stay here, and I swear, I promise you, I will not be upset. I'm not going to have any more children. You don't have any chance of marrying any more of my kids. Why do this to yourself? It's not necessary. Stay here. I love you. Hug you, kiss you goodbye. And Naomi is completely prepared to walk back on her own. And the famous, moving scene where Ruth turns to her mother-in-law and says, I'm not leaving you. I'm not going to be leaving you. This is the first chesed, which later on Boaz refers to when he tells her that she's done so many acts of chesed. The first act of chesed is she didn't leave a bereft mother-in-law. She followed. And then when they finally do return to the country, and they come back and they settle into what once was the property of Naomi and Elimelech, when they lived there, they settle into a much smaller dwelling. They're poor. They have nothing. They have to rely on tzedakah. Boaz, who is the landowner, realizing that he has a biblical obligation to let the poor people come into his field and glean the wheat and the crops in order to fulfill the biblical requirement to let poor come into your property, Peah and Leket and Shika, and he lets them do that. Boaz gladly accepts Ruth into his field. He knows what he's doing. Boaz is considered to be a shofet. He's one of the leaders, a religious leader of the country. And here's a Moabite woman coming back with a relative, and he lets a Moabite woman into his field. And you can just imagine what's being said behind his back by everybody. They're lining up in the supermarket, they're going to Starbucks, they're talking the coffee, and say, Boaz, did he let this woman in? And I'm going to use this word quickly, they're like a shiksa. Oh my God, what's he nuts? What's he doing? How could he be doing that? But Boaz allows her to glean in the field, and he gives her a generous hand. That's an act of chesed. That's Boaz stepping out, and it's an act of, in some ways, bravery. Baruch Hashem, asher lo azav chasdo et hachayim ve'et hametim. And Naomi, when she finds out that her daughter-in-law was allowed to remain in Boaz's field, she blesses God and says, I recognize this as an act of chesed. Of course, this is an act of chesed, completely. And let's go further. More acts of chesed. The whole book is one cascading act of chesed by different images and different personalities. Naomi does kindness for Ruth. Why? Naomi loves Ruth, and she only wants the good things for her. And so when finally it appears that here's Ruth, she has no future. She's living in Beit Lechem. So Naomi knows that here's this beautiful young woman with great midot that Naomi recognizes, maybe nobody else except Boaz. What's her future? She needs to get married. So Naomi takes charge here, and she turns to Ruth and says, she wants to arrange for a shidduch so that her future, now Ruth's future, is well taken care of. She doesn't have to do that. She's already bereft of everything. She could say, let Hashem do what he needs to do. But she takes very active steps to make sure that a link, a shidduch, is set up between Boaz, who is a family member connected to Elimelech, and Ruth. So she is recognizing that there's something here that she owes Ruth. And so Naomi takes an active role. Ruth marries Boaz. That's an act of chesed. Why is that an act of chesed? Because according to our traditional rabbinic sources, Boaz is a much, much older man than Ruth was at the time of their wedding. He was a much older man. And this is an act of chesed on both of their parts. Boaz, who is a man of status and halachic leader in the community, marries this Moabite woman. And he knows that he's marrying a woman that a lot of people are going to whisper about and saying, oh my God, I can't believe he violated the law in the Torah, like I said before. So Boaz is doing an act of chesed. He's an older man, and he marries a younger woman. And he does this in order to help her out. On the other hand, you could say it works both ways. A younger woman agreeing to marry an older man, she should be marrying somebody her own age. She should be thinking about her future rather than marrying somebody who is so much older that how many years are they going to have together? The thing is they didn't have many more years together. Listen to the language that Boaz says to Ruth. Rucha at Lashem biti. You are blessed, my daughter. You are blessed by Hashem. Hitaft chasdecha charon min harishon. Your acts of chesed have grown from now and from the beginning when you did your first act of chesed. Levilti lechet acharei bachorim in dalim asher. He said, I know when you came back to Beit Lechem, I know what you could have done. You could have looked for a young guy. You could have looked for a handsome young dude, and you could have tried to sort of maneuver your way to get close to them and to try to rebuild your life with one of the younger members of the community. but I see that you didn't do that. You didn't do something simply because they were wealthy. You came to my field. And I think Boaz recognized that Ruth made some very deliberate and thoughtful decisions, not based on externalities and not based on values of the culture that might not be positive. She stuck with Boaz because Boaz was the right guy, because he was a leader, because he was a Jewish person who understood the importance of some of the values the Torah is built on. So she sticks with him. And in fact, the Midrash says that they get married, and they have their first intimate act, and Boaz dies shortly thereafter. Ruth gets pregnant and ultimately gives birth, but Boaz dies. So their married life together was a very short period of time, which, as the Meforshim explained, is just an example of how much each one of them was willing to do an act of compassion for the other. Boaz's readiness to marry Ruth was itself a chesed, since the Goel, you remember the story at the end of the Megillat Ruth. So Naomi is aware that there is two relatives in the city, each one of whom, according to the ancient tradition, could have stepped up to marry Naomi's daughter-in-law. One of them is an unnamed person, and his name is never recorded. He's called in the traditional way John Doe, Ploni Almoni. He could be a redeemer. He could be a person to marry Ruth and then inherit whatever is left of Elimelech's estate. And so when Naomi pushed Ruth to approach Boaz and push Boaz into ultimately being the one to agree to marry Ruth, Boaz, who knows full well the halacha, says, I can't marry you until the person who's closer to the family is given first right of refusal. So Boaz knows that he's not allowed to proceed with marrying Ruth until that other unnamed relative makes his decision, either yea, to marry Ruth, in which course then this other unnamed relative will marry Ruth, or to say no, in which point Boaz would be able to marry Ruth. But he knows that he has to do that. And so the story tells us that when Boaz approaches this redeemer, this unnamed redeemed, Ploni Almoni, which is the biblical version of John Doe again, he says, I'm not going to marry her. Why not? Because he says, I don't want to destroy my family reputation, my family lineage. What's the destruction? What is he talking about? And it's clear what he's talking about. This unnamed person is aware that there is a tradition, although it was an incorrect tradition, luckily incorrect, that you're not allowed to accept a Moabite convert into the Jewish community. And so this guy is afraid that if he marries Ruth, it's going to somehow reflect badly on his family, and his kids won't have shidduchim, and who knows what bad luck is going to come, and God's going to punish him. So he says, I'm out of here, not me. But Boaz knows the halacha. And so according to the Meforshim, he convenes a beit din. He brings 10 men. They come to the city center where the beit din is supposed to traditionally sit. And he's in front of everybody. He reestablishes the halacha that the Gemara tells us was originally the halacha, but somehow got, somehow diluted or perverted over time. And he establishes, no, the halacha always was and is that a Moabite man cannot be converted, but a Moabite woman can be converted. And when the unnamed redeemer, the Ploni Almoni, says, no, I'm not going to marry her, Boaz steps in and he resolves the issue. And he takes away the stigma. And everyone in this Megillah, everyone in the Megillah is seen at some point doing good. There are no real negative characters outside of Elimelech at the beginning. He shortly falls off. But from the time that Elimelech, Machlon, and Kilion die, every point along the way, from that point of the story to the end of Megillat Ruth, is a story of people doing chesed for others. In contrast to Eov, Ruth reveals another way in which the world runs. Eov tells us about how does the world run. The world runs through God's, I would say this, God's control. God controls everything. In Yiddish, Gott führt die Welt. God runs the world. Okay, that's the model of Eov. Hashem runs the world. Clearly, that's what happened to Eov. Man, through his own actions, can fix and build, establish, expand, and redeem. That's the message of Ruth. Eov says it's all in God's hands. But if you take a look at the story of Ruth, Everybody else has a role to play that's a healing role. And you look at a community that come together that actually affects the life of somebody else. It's not God. It's all the other people who at moments of critical decision-making make a decision that's based on chesed and thoughtfulness and kindness. And those decisions add up to Megillat Ruth. The world can be built through kindness. Man has a significant form of power. And all the good deeds of Naomi and Ruth and Boaz and all the rest of the people call for Hashem to do his part. It's amazing. They say, okay, God, we're going to do it. We're helping. Now we're going to ask you to give bracha to this person. And the Midrash says, I'll say it this way. I'll read the Midrash because it's a powerful Midrash, but it's a beautiful Midrash. Listen to the words of our Chachamim. Boaz asa et shelo. Boaz did what he had to do. The Ruth asta et shelah. And Ruth did what she was obligated to do. The Nomi asta et shelah. And Nomi did what she had to do. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and God, as it were, says in Shemaim, Af ani e'eseh et sheli. And now I have to do what I have to do. But it's interesting how this Midrash is structured. And the Chachamim who wrote this Midrash, and I don't know who, are making a bold statement. What are they saying? They pushed God's hand. And they said, God, look, we're all doing our chesed. We're all doing our part. Boaz stepped up. He put his reputation in danger. He took a bold step to try to tell everybody, I'm right and you're all wrong. You got the whole halacha wrong. I need to reestablish halacha as hard as it's going to be. I'm going to take that step. Naomi comes back to Beit Lechem, and she does what she can do to sort of regain her place in the community, being thoughtful, being generous, being modest, not pushing, not showy. She pushes Ruth, and Ruth does the same thing. Ruth listens to her mother-in-law. She listens to Boaz. She exemplifies the notion of quiet, yet powerful and noticeable kindness in her demeanor. So Hashem says, if everybody else is acting with chesed, then I have to. So Eov and Ruth, two very different sort of conceptions of the forces that shape our world. So going back to something we said a while ago at the beginning as to when the story is unfolding. The story, of course, is unfolding in the time of the Shoftim, as I mentioned to you. This is a period of time following the death of Yeshua, before the establishment of Shaul HaMelech, which happens in Sefer Shmuel. So there's a period of time where there aren't any kings and there aren't any sort of ruling prophets to guide the people. We have these judges. So the text wanted to express the message of man's responsibility and ability to be active in the world, specifically at this point in time. These stories are not happening at this time for no reason. The story of Ruth is unfolding in the time of the Shoftim, because the time of the Shoftim is a period where there's no identified leader. Identified leaders usually lead. Identified leaders are the ones that set the tone for the community. Our story in Megillat Ruth happens at a time where there's no identified leader. So who sets the tone? We do. The people do. That's how much impact we can have. Where there is no Navi, where there's no prophet, or there's no king, instability and questions arise, and there's no clear direction. That's what ought to have been at a time when there's no leader. But it's precisely at that time that man can choose to do acts of kindness, and through it can build the world and redeem it. So let's just try to sum things up in the last few minutes. There are two ways in which God rules the world. Now, this is all coming from Megillat Ruth, I think. I think this is messages that we don't always think about when we read Megillat Ruth, which fast, we read it, 4 chapters, lovely story, let's go. But I want you to think about this. Two ways in which God rules the world. Number one, fixed from the beginning and according to a hidden plan. That's what it is. There's a plan, and you can't change it, and I can't change it. I don't even know what the plan is. But that's the Eov model. It's the paradigm where God says, I'm running the world. I've made a decision, and you don't know why I made the decision, but it's a decision, it stands, and the chips will fall where they may. It's fixed from the beginning and according to a hidden plan, and man must come to terms with it and accept it as absolute truth. Now, I'm not going to say that that's not wrong. I'm not going to say that's wrong. I'm not going to say, no, that's not a perspective that fits within the Jewish philosophic framework. It is. But it's not the only framework. That is the ego framework. But Ruth steps up. Megillat Ruth, written by Nevi'im, Shmuel. And I think it's important to recognize that this book is a holy book. And we read it because I think the other paradigm is equally important to us. The other paradigm of how God rules the world is that it's placed in the hands of man to a certain degree. And man, is given almost unlimited power to influence his world. It's such an empowering concept. That's what the Midrash is saying. Everybody does their part, and that influences God to do his part. We can. If we choose a certain way of building the world, God will respond. So it's in our power. It's in our power. So Ruth comes to stress man's ability and obligation to do good. And this is power which is meaningful, real, and it's so real that it brings about the birth of David HaMelech, from whom Mashiach comes. So think about that for 1 second. That's an extraordinary idea. We believe in the ultimate Redeemer. We believe in the Mashiach, who will arrive at some point in time. And we don't know when, but we want it to happen soon. But the Mashiach is a direct descendant of David, meaning that the power of the chesed of Megillat Ruth is so intense, is so long-lasting, that the arrival of the Mashiach is a direct result of a bunch of people living in Beit Lechem who decide to lead their lives filled with chesed. Wow. Like, what could we do? How far-reaching would our chesed be if our community decided we wanted to exemplify the same type of chesed that Boaz exemplified, that Nomi exemplified, that Ruth exemplified? Just how much could we alter the world? How much could we force Hashem's hand and say, look, you may have the ultimate right, you may have the Eov model, but we have the root model. And you know that if we stick to our root model, you have to stick to your model too. You have to respond. It's an extraordinary idea. So let's answer one last question before we end our shiur. Why do we read the story on Hashavua? So a couple of answers. Number one, as I said before, to tell us David HaMelech's Yidus. We've got to establish his Yidus so that there be no detractors ever to question whether David HaMelech was an appropriate heir to the throne. Don't forget, because David HaMelech becomes the progenitor of the Mashiach, establishing his rightful approach to the throne is not insignificant in a theological, long-lasting framework. Number two, one of the reasons, if you like gematria, so root is made up of 3 letters, Resh, Vav, Tav. Resh is 200, Vav is 6, and Tav is 4. So that adds up to 606. 606. The number 606 doesn't usually mean a lot. 613 does, right? 613 are the number of mitzvahs in the Torah. So Ruth did 7 mitzvot, plus the 606 adds up to 613. Ruth somehow this embodies the notion of acceptance of the Torah, which means also she converted, which she did. Conversion in the time of Ruth is not the same type of conversion in our time, the year 2023, but she did convert. And what happens in Shavuot? It's the acceptance of Torah. Ruth embodies and symbolizes the notion of a person's willingness to acceptance of the Torah. And so it makes sense that on the day in which we accept the Torah, by reading the Torah, we celebrate the Chag Shavuot, we should read the story. But I want to suggest also one other answer in this regard. Based on our comparison between Eov and Ruth, the message of roots may also have another sort of part to it. We call Shavuot Zman Matan Toratenu. We don't call it Zman Kabbalah Toratenu. Zman Matan Toratenu means the time of the giving of our Torah. We do not refer to Shavuot as the time of our acceptance of the Torah, because each person accepts Torah differently, or maybe not even at all. We can't call Shavuot the time of the acceptance of our Torah because each of us are going to experience that differently. So therefore, a collective name may not be appropriate. Giving of the Torah is a correct term to describe a historical truth of this time. God spoke the Ten Commandments and shared Torah with the Jewish people. That's true. Did everybody accept the Torah? That's a very good question. What preceded the story of Matan Torah in the Torah? Well, as you remember the story, so this means from the time they left Mitzrayim until the time of Shavuot, as you know, is a 50-day period. We count Sphira. But during that 50 days, from the time they left Mitzrayim until the time they received the Torah, one of the unfortunate incidents that happened to the Jewish people was the attack, the vicious, barbaric attack of Amalek. That happened in a place called Rephidim prior to their arrival in the desert of Sinai. The Torah tells us that this was a deadly attack where the back of the camp was attacked, those who were infirm, those who were weak, those who couldn't walk as quickly. And you can just imagine how brutal and barbaric it must have seemed. They've escaped Egypt. They're all looking forward to a new future. Comes this sword-bearing horse, like soaking the blood of the desert, soaking the sands of the desert with the blood, men, women, and children. What's the result of that? Now, I don't mean what's the result in terms of the story. The result is, of course, Hashem tells Moshe to collect an army under the leadership of Yeshua and to engage on the way back. But what was the psychological impact? What was the psychological impact of that moment? And I'm going to suggest to you that the attack of Amalek may, in fact, have introduced into the psyche of the Jewish people an element of doubt, an element of fear, an element of not understanding how God is involved in the world and deals with his people. Like, why would Hashem have let this happen? And we could see people asking that question. God, you took us out of Egypt. What did you do to my grandparents? You let this happen to them. How? How? I thought you loved us. I thought you protected us. What happened to the fire and the clouds? Where did it all go? What? This moment of Amalek could have been a moment that created for some Jews, maybe not for everybody, a small degree or not small degree of uncertainty. If Hashem was there in Mitzrayim and he was there at Yam Suf, why was he not there to protect us against Amalek? Powerful question. And maybe that explains why there's a midrash that says that at the moment of the giving of the Torah, Hashem inverted the Mount Sinai and he held it over them as a barrel, meaning that there was an element of coercion that took place at Sinai. They were uncertain about the acceptance of the Torah, and it was hard for the people to accept or understand it in the way in which God led the world. So maybe the people, when they said, okay, do you want Torah? And they said, Naseh v'nishma. They said Naseh v'nishma, but in a certain place in their minds and their hearts, they were uncertain how this was going to unfold. Similar to the difficulties that Eov experienced at his tragic loss and suffering. In fact, according to the Gemara in Masechet Shabbos, the element of doubt was so profound and so real that there was always an element of doubt in the minds of the Jewish people until it was ultimately removed and all doubts and all uncertainties were washed away. You know when it happened? It happened in the story of Purim. When the Jewish people saw the downfall of Haman, who was a direct descendant of Amalek, and saw how he was completely decimated and his family, that somehow resolved a lot of unspoken collective doubt of the Jewish people over a period of hundreds of years. The Gemara tells us in the Masechet Shabbat that although the Jews had, as it were, technically accepted the Torah at the time of Har Sinai, it wasn't until the time of Hashverosh and Mordechai and Esther and Shushan that there was a complete and total embrace of the Torah and all that it stood for. So Purim for us also represents a moment of Matan Torah and acceptance of the Torah. So Shavuot is called Zman Matan Toratenu, symbolizes the fundamental philosophic challenge that faces each of us, which is a question of our understanding of God's role in the universe, man's responsibility during his lifetime. What's happening here? Where's the balance? How do I navigate a world in which I can't answer all the questions? I don't know why there's suffering. I don't know why bad things happen to good people. I don't know why. Why did Amalek attack? Why, in what I thought was a safe world where I believed that I did all the right things, why did these things happen? So how do I respond to that? How do I respond to the Eov challenges in life? And perhaps it's appropriate that Shavuot has no specific mitzvot or rituals which might divert our attention from this essential aspect. We don't have any specific things that we do. The cheesecake stuff and staying up all night, although those are customs, are not essential to the Torah's experience of what Shavuot is supposed to mean to us. But maybe our challenge is enormous. Our challenge is significant. If you take these questions deeply and you think about them enough, those are big questions. Like why? How? Why is it okay, God? But what do we do in the face of our inability to answer some of these big questions? What do we do when we encounter suffering and tragedy like Eov? What do we do when we encounter suffering and tragedy that we don't have any answer to, like Amalek? What do we do when we think we've encountered a philosophical enigma and we don't know how to proceed? And the answer, my friends, what I think is blood root. We engage in chesed. For if we do that, chesed can lift us up and restore power and direction in our lives. Chesed can redeem. It can make a huge difference. Naomi thought that her life was over. She had no answers. She just knew that she was worthy of God's anger, and that's why this all happened. And then she encounters chesed, and things turn. She's not only the recipient, she's the doer. Chesed can redeem, it can rebuild, and apparently it can even rejuvenate. And so on Shavuot, when we embrace the Torah and begin to consider some of the mysteries of our own commitment, we are encouraged and comforted by knowing that a deliberate choice to do chesed lies right in front of us. Chesed can not only sustain, but it can redeem us. And perhaps that's too why Chazal thought that we should read this story on Shavuot. We began with a comparison of Elliott and Ruth, but I'm hoping by the end you can see that it's the power of the chesed in Ruth that sometimes has the ability to change the world. I don't know God's plan, but maybe my plan can change God's plan. That's what that Midrash was saying. When Hashem saw Boaz did what he was supposed to do, Naomi did what she was supposed to do, Ruth did what she was supposed to do, then Hashem says, I guess I have to do what I'm supposed to do. Son, if we do what we're all supposed to do, then maybe Megillat Ruth, one of the most favorite books of all the Tanakh, at least one of mine, won't just be a story. It'll be a guide for all of us. And if we do what we're supposed to do, as I often say, maybe next Shavuot, we're not going to be on Zoom. We'll be sitting around a table somewhere in Yerushalayim, reading the story and dancing around, waiting to greet the Mashiach as we build a new Beit HaMikdash. Thank you, everybody, for joining, not just for tonight, but always. You can certainly unmute yourselves. And for those who came late, I did say that for the next 2 weeks, I have commitments at school, which will conflict with the Tuesday night class. And we'll have to see whether as we get into June and summer months, whether we're going to continue. But at least for the next 2 weeks, we're not going to have a class. But I want to thank all of you. I know that Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock, and we shifted times and we took a break. So for those who've been kind enough and patient enough with me, just want to tell you how much it's meant to me to be able to learn with you and to share ideas with you. And I hope it's been meaningful to you as well. I get excited by the study of Torah. I really see this as something that enlightens, enriches, makes us into better people. I really do, as long as we just want to let it happen. And as I always say, I think Hashem loves questions. And sometimes the questions remain as questions. Shir Shemaim hosted a guest this past weekend, Rabbi Dr. Rabbi Zera, who had studied closely with Rabbi Sachs for a long time, and he said one little tiny story, but it symbolizes the point I'm about to make. He said in a conversation that Rabbi Sachs had with Rabbi Zera, he said, I've been thinking about this question for 25 years, and I think I finally found an answer to it. We have questions, but that's okay. God's not afraid of questions, and neither should we. Sometimes we have to learn how to live with them, but they're good because it's from questions that I think we get to the honesty of the Torah and the meaning behind it. So I just want to thank all of you and invite in comments or thoughts or questions, but I won't answer them. That's a joke. For tonight, and anybody has something they want to share, please feel free to do so.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hey, Marty, thank you for joining again.
I just had your share made me think of a story that I hadn't thought about in 50 years.
Whoa.
When I was in first year at the UT, I took a course in Canadian history. And we had a TA, a very nice TA, who was a graduate student, and she was writing a book on letters that people wrote to the Prime Minister of Canada during the Depression. And I don't remember any of the letters except there was a group of them. It was people writing the Prime Minister telling him of their neighbors were cheating in taking what the government was giving them. And this was not one or two letters, this was hundreds of letters, writing the Prime Minister to tell on their neighbors and friends so they could get more. And I remember thinking, I never heard any of those kinds of stories about the Shiur. Because you may know what it is to be around Shiur survivors. And what you said tonight about Chesed is very important because we see that we don't always act that way.
Right. We don't. It's a challenge, Marty. It is a challenge. But I think the story of Ruth is set to be not just aspirational, but I think it is set to tell us of what's possible, that there can be communities that make a point of building chesed into the fabric of their society. It takes deliberate action. It takes, in some degree, I think, sacrifice. And I think in the story of Ruth, it takes people to also take a step back from attitudes that they have to examine whether those attitudes are really fair. And that's why I think in some ways Megillat Ruth is a really powerful social commentary. Thank you for sharing that, Marty. I really appreciate that. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I want to wish everybody a wonderful week and wish you Chag Sameach. May the Shavuot be a joyous one for you and your families. May the experience of considering what Torah is in your life be something that enriches you and helps animate you for the days, the weeks, and the months ahead, and maybe for the rest of your lives. So have a good night, all, and I wish you a Chag Sameach and Shabbat Shalom as well. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.